Today, the Treasury, Mr. Osborne, unveiled his shock and horror report on Brexit, forecasting that growth would be down by about 4% over the next 2 years. Now, how did they get this forecast? It's always interesting. I'm a forecaster and a modeler, so of course I immediately go into the engine room and ask, how did the engine produce this set of numbers? Now, the way a model works, basically it works from the long term to the short term. It won't surprise you that what drives the Treasury's results, like what drives any results of a change in the environment, is the forecast of what will happen in the long term as a result of Brexit. So at the heart of the Treasury's forecast of the short run is their forecast of the long run, which came out a few weeks before. And the set of assumptions they made for the long run, I'm afraid, comes into the category of deliberately deceitful. I'm sorry to use quite strong words for a kind of academic, but they've been kind of wrung out of me. Now, so the first ingredient of the short term is this very gloomy assessment of the long term under Brexit, which I'll talk about in a minute because it requires to be taken apart quite carefully. And then the other two elements, well, the other element really in the Treasury's forecast, which is quite soft and, not very strongly founded, is all about uncertainty. And the extra uncertainty due to Brexit affects spending directly through confidence of consumers and investors, and indirectly through more volatility in financial markets. That's the story. And you might want to add as a footnote, who is causing the most uncertainty in this environment? Her Majesty's Treasury. It's astonishing. So if we do get Brexit, which obviously they're trying to prevent with everything in their power, they will have on day one of Brexit to turn around and say, oops, what are we going to do? And was everything we said correct? Because now we're in charge of the post-Brexit economy, and we've, like, dear old Gerald Ratner, who said his jewellery was, he used to go around the dinner circuit, didn't he, making this joke that he sold crap jewellery. He didn't really mean it, but of course it came to haunt him, and it became a big factor in his business. And the Treasury is doing the same. It's going around saying the economy is going to be crap after Brexit, and it will have to actually run it if Brexit happens, which of course it may well do. We don't know yet, do we? So on this uncertainty factor, I think we have to say, well, the main uncertainty is being whipped up by those that are trying to tell us it'll all be terrible after Brexit. And of course, after Brexit, those very same people have to kind of put their shoulders to the wheel, make sure that the British economy does okay. And I think the truth is, once all this debate is over, it'll be seen, I'll explain why in a minute, when we look at the long-term prospect, to have been a big fuss over something that's actually pretty good. And it won't cause uncertainty, it'll cause a revision of plans, which is basically good for the British economy. And therefore, the uncertainty will quickly dissipate after the debate is over. Now, what is this long-term issue? When they produced their long-term projection of what would happen under Brexit, they gave two main options. What they call the EEA, or Norwegian option, which they costed at minus 4% on GDP. And then the other one was what they called the WTO option, which they costed at minus 8% on GDP. These figures are long-term effects of doing it rather than staying where you are. So obviously they're not about growth rates or anything. They're comparing what would have happened without with what happens with. Now, there are two things to say about the way they got these numbers, which I totally disagree with, and I'll explain why. First of all, there's a question of the methods they used. The methods they used were to take past associations between various things like joining the EU or joining the EEA or other trade agreements, and see what in the past, across a load of countries, these events were associated with in the way of foreign direct investment and trade of all the various countries that they looked at, which is basically the whole world since the war. And these are just associations that they found. And then they looked at the whole bunch of associations between FDI and trade, the amount of trade as a percent of GDP, and productivity in the UK across lots of sectors. And these are, again, associations. Now, those associations cannot be used to predict a complex policy regime change like Brexit, which does all sorts of things to the economy that are not mimicked in those previous associations. I give this example of an association. You see your dog very happy, right? And its tail is wagging vigorously. So you think, there's an association there. The tail's wagging vigorously and the dog's very happy. So let me grab the tail, make the dog happy by wagging it vigorously. It doesn't work, does it, ladies and gentlemen? If you've got a dog and you've ever tried, the dog will be very, very unhappy. And that illustrates how the things that produce these associations cannot be literally interpreted as causal relationships that you can manipulate. And that's exactly what the Treasury have done in their report. So the whole methodology is pretty badly founded. To analyze Brexit, you've got to have a causal set of relationships and see what would happen causally. That's actually what we've done. And let's take the WTO option. What did we assume about the WTO option, which we believe to be optimal for British citizens? Now, we're not saying it'll actually happen, because what's optimal doesn't always happen, does it? We know, as Adam Smith said, there's a lot of ruin in a nation. We don't always do it perfect. But we have to have a benchmark of what's optimal, and then we know in practice it won't be quite so good. So what's optimal when we leave the EU? The optimal thing is to go to free trade. The EU is a customs union which protects manufacturing. It's got the common agricultural policy, which effectively does the same thing for agriculture. And how big is the protection the EU creates? It's about 20%. Tariff equivalent. That is a huge level of protection. And what it does is it raises prices inside the protected area, inside the single market, which is the regulated area that's protected. It raises those prices by about a fifth, 20%. So if we leave this protected area and go to free trade, what we're doing is increasing the free trade of the British economy to 100% coverage. At the moment, it's got limited coverage because we're protected inside the EU. I calculate something like 70% of our trade is basically under free trade rules, under the WTO, services, and the part we sell outside the EU. But the rest, the 30% odd, is inside the EU, highly protected. But the optimal thing, as any kind of first-year student of economics knows, free trade, going to more free trade, dominates being in protected area. So the optimal thing is to go to free trade. If we do that, and it's a very purist benchmark, then what happens is prices fall 20%, trade with the rest of the world expands vigorously, our industries that are unprotected expand because they're no longer subject to this incubus of too high prices of what they buy. Our consumers are massively better off because prices, of course, fall in the shops. Instead of paying over the odds for stuff they can get at world prices, they're much better off. And so when we put this into our kind of causal model of world trade, we've got a little group called Economists for Brexit, which have done a lot of work on this. And you can find our website, economistsforbrexit.co.uk, find all this there. What we find is that GDP rises 4%. So what have the Treasury done? What's the bit of, what's the Mickey Finn they've slipped into their long-term calculations to get the opposite result, which is minus 8%? How did they do it? Well, two things, really. One is the methods, which are different, but that's not the main thing. The main thing is the assumption they made. What did they assume when we left the EU and for the WTO option, which is the best option? They assumed we kept all the protection exactly the same as now. Instead of going to free trade, we simply say, oops, we're outside the EU, so we'll put a tariff of 20% on everybody all around the world. Now, is that crazy or is that crazy? That is what the Treasury assumed. Now, that is an astonishing assumption. When quizzed about it in the Treasury Select Committee, Mr. Osborne by Jacob Rees-Mogg, Mr. Osborne said, oh, well, he said, it's okay to assume that because those lever types, they're all protectionists. Now, it is true that someone has mentioned helping steel. But that helping steel doesn't make you a protectionist. It just makes you sensible. The US, which are generally free trading nation, they have protection about a third of the level of the EU, which is not bad for a big modern nation that's kind of democratically controlled, etc. And they have just put a tariff on steel, an anti-dumping duty of 267% on steel. That doesn't make them protectionist. It just makes them reactive under anti-dumping rules, which are perfectly okay in the WTO, to a particular situation, and that will go away in the end. So the point I'm making is that if levers have said they might protect steel under anti-dumping rules when they're free of European Union constraints, that's an entirely respectable position that's completely consistent with free trade. And as I said, when we go to free trade, it doesn't mean we'll do everything that's totally free in perfection. It's a benchmark. There will be, of course, in a democracy, deviations from this. But the point is, there's a long way between minus 8%, which assumes you're completely lunatic, which is what the Treasury have said we will assume will happen, and plus 4%, which assumes you achieve a good benchmark situation. The situation may be closer to 4 than to minus 8. Quite a lot closer. In fact, it'll be positive. And we will probably do things like have agreements with, the EU on things like cars. I mean, they will come to us and say, look, we want to have access to your car market. Look, let's do something that is transitional for some period for some of these critical industries. That will all happen. And it will give us slightly less than complete free trade that I've assumed, but it'll be a close approximation, and it'll be pretty good. So what the Treasury have done is two, in my opinion, intellectually criminal things. And also, I think, politically criminal. They have actually deceived the British people deliberately by making this entirely false assumption. They fed it into their long-term model and got a decline of 8%, where the truth is plus 4. They fed it into the short-term model, where they're predicting, a recession and all sorts of mayhem. This is intellectually disgraceful, politically deceitful, and totally irresponsible by the ministry that is supposed to be running the British economy and will be responsible for it after this Brexit vote, which could go, as they know very well, either way. So on that note, ladies and gentlemen, I conclude and say, well, my erstwhile employer has gone into the gutter. And that's upsetting, because probably I've got to go into the gutter with it. And because I don't see any other way to fight such a kind of deceitful and kind of cynical approach to our public affairs.
I find the Treasury and the Bank of England's decision to publicly enter the forecasting arena on very specific, relatively short-term forecasts around such a politically sensitive subject curious. And I think it does mean we need to ask ourselves, how good have they been at forecasting currencies and economic output in the past? The last time we had a really big devaluation of our currency, something they're now forecasting for Brexit, was between the summer of 2008 and the early months of 2009. And during that short period, the pound fell 30% against the dollar. I think if you look back at the Treasury and Bank of England forecasts ahead of that event, they did not forecast any kind of serious devaluation whatsoever. So what can we learn from that? Well, I think we can learn two very important things from that. The first is you can and you have had serious big devaluations during our time in the European Union. So the possibility of a falling pound outside the European Union would not be a unique experience to being outside the European Union. And the other thing you can conclude is that the Treasury can make mistakes. So then you have to ask, is that a one-off, or do they regularly make mistakes? And I fear that on the big changes and movements, they regularly make mistakes. One of the most important things you had to forecast to try and anticipate changes in the world economy and the British economy over the last 2 years was the oil price. And the oil price more than halved. And if you look back to the Treasury and Bank of England forecasts just before that began, you will see absolutely no forecast in there of a major change in direction of the oil price, and that obviously threw out their forecast for economic activity, real incomes, inflation, and everything else. One that mattered far more was the dreadful misforecasts at the time of the European exchange rate mechanism. I remember it only too well, because as a member of the government that embarked on that hapless and unfortunate course, I was one of the few within the government arguing we should not do it. I had the whole weight of the Treasury, Bank of England and European establishment rained against myself and the little band who were saying, do not enter the exchange rate mechanism. We thought that it would either cause a big inflation or a big recession. We were wrong because it caused both. It was just that they happened in succession, one to the other. The authorities were absolutely sure that the exchange rate mechanism would add to our GDP, would cut inflation, and would be a thoroughly benign process. And we know that it caused a very large recession, damaging people's jobs and businesses at the time. So I feel very strongly that the Treasury and the Bank of England are in no moral or intellectual position to claim, based on their past experience of trying to forecast the future of the euro, the future of the exchange rate mechanism, or the future of the oil price and currencies, that they now have some unique insight into the future of our economy and trading patterns that makes you want to listen and respect their view at this very important juncture. The history seems to say that they always assume the best with anything to do with the European Union, and history seems to tell us that unfortunately all too often, whether it be the exchange rate mechanism or the euro itself or the pattern of regulation and banking control that we've seen grow up in the European Union in recent years, the worst usually happens. Our continent is ravaged by mass unemployment, particularly youth unemployment, and they do absolutely nothing intelligent to sort it out. They've had a long-running banking disaster going on since 2005-06, and they still haven't managed their way through it, and they still have a series of crippled banks holding back the economic output and therefore the trade of all those involved with the European Union. So on this crucial matter of trade, which we're going to hear very elegantly from Peter Lilley about, I am absolutely sure of two fundamental things. The first, I can reassure the British public that our trade is not at risk if and when we leave the European Union. I had this on good authority. I had the advantage of a working lunch with senior representatives of the German government late last year when they were over finalising the negotiations with the government, and they wanted to hear from myself and a couple of other people who didn't necessarily share the government's view of what would be a satisfactory negotiation. And I'm delighted to report that when we asked them what they would think if the UK started imposing WTO levels of tariff and barrier, where they are higher than the European Union ones, on things that mattered to Germany, they said no, they didn't want that at all, and they didn't expect any of that to happen. And so then we said, well, we're delighted because we have no wish to put a 10% tariff on German cars. It's the one area where you could have a considerably higher tariff. But in turn, we would assume that Germany wouldn't want to impose barriers in the way of the things that we were very good at selling to them. And they said, of course not, we fully understand there has to be equivalence. And as Germany sells us twice as much as we sell them in the trade in goods, Germany fully understands that she needs to protect that trade by not imposing new barriers and understands that we wouldn't want new barriers on service trade as part of that deal. So that's the first thing I can reassure you. It is in their interests not to impose new barriers. They have no wish to impose new barriers, and I can't see that any likely British government will want to impose those new barriers, and so we can be reassured about our trade. And the second thing I'd like to reassure people is that I do not think there is some special threat to the City of London because we have entered into some arrangements which include the famous passports which they could withdraw and make our jobs at risk and challenge our very successful city businesses. The government says that the passport is a unique way of doing business and that we would lose it if we left the European Union. Well, my contacts suggest they wouldn't withdraw it, and it'd be quite difficult for them to withdraw it. But let us examine that. The government rightly says that the most successful and the most important passported product or service is under UKITS, the directive which allows you to establish an investment fund in one place in the European Union and then to be able to sell it all around the European Union under European regulations. And I agree with them. It's been a successful grouping of products under a European regulatory system, and it is commonly used. But of course, when you look at what has happened, you will discover that practically every UKITS fund is domiciled not in London, but either in Dublin or in Luxembourg. So once we leave the European Union, these funds will still be legal domiciled funds in 2 European Union countries, and we will still have exactly the same contracts to work for them and to offer services to them that we have at the moment, and they will not be legally impaired by our leaving the European Union. So I cannot see how they say that the passport will be at risk when we know the results. But the other reason the passport is not at risk is because when these matters were last developed and negotiated around the Brussels table, the United States of America came over and was also present in part of the dialogues and negotiations. And the United States of America insisted on the inclusion of a very important clause in the financial regulations which says that if you regulate your financial services to an equivalent level to that of the European Union, then of course you can trade freely with the European Union, just as the European Union can then trade freely with those countries, which is what's in it for the European Union. So we now have the doctrine of equivalence to protect our trade in services with the European Union once we've left, as well as the way in which the passports work and the ability to carry on with passported products, particularly if they're already domiciled in Dublin or Luxembourg. So, ladies and gentlemen, I have great news for you. We will not lose trade when we leave the European Union. I think we will increase our trade in other places in the way that Patrick and Peter will be illustrating. There is no special new threat to the city, although it is true that inside the European Union we often have to work very hard to protect the city from regulatory threats which the European Union likes to visit upon us. And above all, ladies and gentlemen, there is absolutely no threat of a Brexit-inspired recession based on a collapse in sterling and all the other things that they have been forecasting. And one final thought, were they to be true, that we're about to enter a period when sterling actually fell, wouldn't that start to turn the balance of payments around, and wouldn't that actually generate jobs in Britain replacing imports? And so there would be a self-correcting mechanism. But of course, the Romanians always leave out all the items in the equation which lead to more jobs, more prosperity, and higher incomes. Above all, they always leave out the fact that once you start spending the 10 billion of net contribution that we give away and don't get back on jobs and services here in Britain, there is an immediate 0.6% stimulus to our economic output in that first year and every other year. So in order to prove we're going to be worse off, the Romanians have to find even more damage, respectively, because we, on the other side, can point to a simple fact that if you spend the money at home, you get better off.
I speak to you as a member of an endangered species. I think I'm the only member of Parliament remaining who's negotiated a trade deal, and John and I are the only remaining members of Parliament who introduced the single market. John did all the heavy lifting and I took all the credit. It was what we call a division of labour in economic terms. But it is very distressing that when politicians have no experience of a subject, they simply latch on to whatever sounds plausible and supports their case. And since 99% of people in the political world have absolutely no experience of trade matters, they simply latch on to what sounds plausible and supports their case. So I'm going to go through a few plausible assertions that are commonly used about trade and see how well they stand up. First of all, there's an implicit assumption in the whole debate that trade deals are important. As a former trade minister, as I say, serving Secretary of State for Trade and Industry, who negotiated a trade deal, the Uruguay round, back in the 90s, I have a vested interest in bigging them up. But the truth is, they are much less important than people imagine. Countries prosper if they produce goods and services of a quality and at a price that people want to buy. It can help a bit if they've got a trade deal or an absence of barriers, but actually they'll always survive if they produce good goods and services, and they won't do so well and won't prosper so well if they don't. They matter far less than they used to in the past, partly because of the success of the Uruguay round, which brought down tariffs across the world. So that tariffs now between developed countries average somewhere around 1%, 2%, or 3% across the board. So they're not big deal. The movement in exchange rate in a week is often bigger than that. Yeah. But if there are any worthwhile trade deals, they're deals with fast-growing developing countries which do still have high levels of protection and which would be better to negotiate away. So the first thing is, don't get carried away about how important trade deals are. If one is trading simply as a member of the WTO, one has great protection in world markets. And go down to the shops and look in the shops, and you'll find goods from every country in the world, 132 of whom we have no trade deal with at all. Second question is there £10 billion a year net contribution to the EU, as the Prime Minister asserted, a small price to pay for tariff-free access to the European market? Well, if we left the EU with no trade deal at all, and like John, I think it's inconceivable that they will not negotiate a free trade deal with us. There's a free trade arrangement across the whole of Europe, including both EU countries and all the non-EU countries, from Iceland to Turkey and from Portugal to the borders of Russia, and it's inconceivable we would not be part of it. But if we left with no EU free trade deal, it's the WTO tariffs that we would face on our exports to the EU would average 2.4%. But the £10 billion we pay annually is equivalent to a tariff of 7% on our exports. Do the arithmetic. 10 billion by whatever is 160 billion, you get over 7%. So we're paying a premium of 7% in order to avoid a cost of 2.4%. It is worse mis-selling than PPI, and that costs a lot of people a lot of money in fines for indulging in that. It means, of course, that if we did leave, and because tariffs are uneven, some companies and some industries would face higher WTO tariffs than others would face zero because there are no tariffs, we would be able to compensate our exporters if we wished. You have to do it through an export development fund to comply with WTO rules, and they would be no worse off than they are now, because we would be able to afford to do so and still have £7 billion left over. So it stands to reason that if our former partners were actually motivated by hatred and angst and wanted to do us down, they would realize, and therefore wanted and were prepared to run a trade war, they couldn't win, because our exporters could be no worse off, whereas those would pay similar tariffs to get into our market, and they would have lost £10 billion and not have the money to support them. So they would very soon agree to a deal. In fact, I don't think we'd ever get there, but that's the theoretical position, which once analysed realise it means you don't need to worry about it. Now, the other reason we will get a good deal with the EU, and continue our free trade arrangement, is just look at what they're doing. They're trying to arrange a trade deal with America. And they're making huge concessions to America in order to do so. The TTIP arrangements, which are going to be debating in the House of Commons this evening, which most people in Europe don't want, but it's a price that the EU think worthwhile in order to get rid of the tariffs and other problems that exist in trade with the US. Well, you say, well, the US is a huge market. Of course, they're prepared to make concessions to the US. We are a bigger market for Europe's goods, the rest of Europe's goods, than America is. We import more from the rest of the EU than America does. The idea that they're not going to make concessions to us when they do to America is simply balmy. And now, the next assertion that I come across frequently is that, membership of the EU helps us negotiate free trade deals with other countries. I'm afraid in my experience, that's not so. The more countries that are involved in negotiating a trade deal, the harder it is, the longer it takes, the less comprehensive the result, because the more of the exceptions insisted on by all the different parties to it. That's why the Uruguay round was difficult. We eventually succeeded. The subsequent Doha round has been going on forever and hasn't reached agreement. But Europe has to negotiate as 28 countries, each with a veto. It makes it very difficult, at the best of times, made more difficult by quite a number of those countries being essentially protectionist and not really wanting free trade with other countries. By contrast, if you negotiate bilaterally, it's simple, it's quick, and it's likely to be much more comprehensive. The trouble is, because EU is so bad and slow and meets such internal opposition from within to negotiating free trade agreements, they haven't got any deals with the countries it would be valuable to have deals with, like China, India, Brazil, Australia. Now, others say, well, it may be difficult, it may take time, but the clout the EU gives you is better for negotiating a trade deal, and you get a better deal. I'm afraid that is simply not true either. Not only do you not get deals, but it results in far more exceptions and exemptions. Look at the success of Chile, which has trade deals with countries whose total GDP is 5 times that of the countries with which the EU has trade deals. Switzerland, likewise. Even Iceland has a trade deal with China, whereas the EU does not. And Switzerland, likewise, has a trade deal with China. What's more, those deals that those countries have negotiated seem to work well. If you look up the Swiss government website, you see that on average, once Switzerland negotiates a trade deal, the growth of its exports to that country doubles in the subsequent 5 years compared with the previous 5 years. Look at the EU deals that we are automatically party of. There are about 20 which have had 5 years' experience since they were negotiated. Of those 20, in 15, our trade has grown more slowly after the deal was arranged than before. And the 5 where it's grown faster are Turkey and Chile, which are significant markets, but the others, I think, are Papua New Guinea, Fiji, and the Lebanon, not exactly our target markets. Why is that? It's partly because the EU has, insofar as negotiated trade deals, done so essentially for political, not trade reasons, with countries neighbouring it and on the Mediterranean rim or former colonies and so on, rather than focusing on the markets which our children, the next generation's prosperity is going to depend on our ability to trade with India and China and Brazil, not with Fiji or with Eastern Europe. And then there's another assertion that goes on that we will lose access to the single market if we're not members of the EU. It's strange how people talk about the single market as if it was a sort of inner sanctum within the European market, which only European countries have access to. I often, when journalists say to me, won't we lose access to the single market if we're not part of the EU? I say, well, we haven't lost access to the American single market because we're not part of the United States of America. They say, but America doesn't have a single market. America is a single market. America is what the EU in some ways is aspiring to become. 132 members of the World Trade Organization who are not part of the EU have access to the single market. Some have to pay tariffs, some do not, but they will have access to it. So we shouldn't allow it to be treated as if it's something rare and arcane. What the single market consists of, by and large, and as I say, John and I negotiated and implemented the single market program back in the 90s, is first of all the harmonization of product rules in the European Union. That's a sensible thing. It means that instead of having to produce a different range of fridges or motor cars or whatever for 28 different markets, you can produce one range for the whole of Europe. That's very beneficial. But it's as beneficial to an American company exporting to Europe as to a German company exporting within Europe. It'll be as beneficial to a British company when we're outside the EU as it is when we're inside. So don't allow yourself to be convinced there's something magical about the single market. It's simply the market of the European Union, to which under World Trade Organization all countries have access. Some pay a tariff, modest tariff, some do not. Then we get to the argument, yes, but we have influence in determining those rules. If we're not members, we will not have influence. Well, Britain's had more influence in setting rules worldwide than any other country. We set the rules of lawn tennis, but we only win once in every 70 years. Setting the rules doesn't give a particular advantage to one country or another operating within those rules. Whatever the particular axle width you decide on for motor cars in the European Union, everybody will produce cars of that width. It doesn't give any advantage to one country rather than another. But if we look at what's actually happened since the single market, the performance of British exports has been rather disappointing. Our exports to the rest of the European Union have grown more slowly than other member states' exports to other countries within the single union, and less rapidly still than exports of countries outside the EU, whose exports to the EU have grown more rapidly even than exports within it. So if it was intended to give a special advantage to members, it doesn't seem to have worked, and certainly it hasn't worked for us. Now, John mentioned passporting and that aspect of things. I negotiated the first passporting bill when I was still in the Treasury, the Second Banking Directive, which gave British banks based in London, the right to trade across Europe through branches regulated just by their home regulator, the Bank of England, or the whatever the regulator we establish is. And I thought that was a great and wonderful thing. Having implemented the single market program and it was all up and running, I decided to make a speech on how wonderful an achievement this was, because I wanted to take credit for John's work. And I asked officials to find examples of companies who were doing things now as a result of the implementation of the single market, including using passporting and so on, which they weren't doing before. They came back with lots of examples of companies who were doing things to sell to Europe that they hadn't done before. But all of them could have done them before, and it was only the great publicity of the single market that made some of our rather sleepier companies realise that there was a market 22 miles away across the channel, and so they'd gone and done things. That was good, excellent. But almost no one had taken advantage of passporting. Since then, as John Redwood mentioned, we've had further directives, UKITS, Minford and so on, which also have passporting, and a number of British companies have taken advantage of that. But like the banks, they can if they wish, and like the UKITS company, they can if they wish, set up subsidiaries in those countries and operate through a subsidiary, just as any other country can, and many of them will. So, is the city at risk? No. Look at where the great financial centres are across the world. They're New York, London, Singapore, and Hong Kong. What have they all got in common? Anglo-Saxon law, common law, reliable legal system which people trust, our accounting standards, all the infrastructure that has built up in Anglo-Saxon countries around banking. People trust it, people like it, it's helped develop that, and it's created an agglomeration of talent which has not emerged in any of the other countries with different legal systems and so on. What we are selling, in a way, is the fruits of common law, the fruits of our accounting systems, the fruits of our trustworthy governance and so on. And that won't change if we leave, but it may change if we remain, because it's constantly being eroded as European law, European directives impose themselves on London. I had to chair the joint committee of both houses and all parties which considered the legislation we brought in after the financial crash. We produced it, it was jolly good, and we realised towards the end that we were shadowboxing. We were deciding what Britain's legislation should be to regulate our financial services, but coming down the line were 59 different pieces of legislation from the European Union which were going to replace or displace them. So I went over to Brussels and met Mr. Barnier, the Single Market Commissioner, and said to him, look, all my committee, both peers and members of the House of Commons, Labour, Liberal, Conservative, all support the single market. You say these measures coming down the stream are necessary to create a single market. We can't actually see any of them that remove barriers to trade for British companies, banks and financial institutions. All of them are about centralising control and moving it to European institutions away from British regulators. And he said, ah, mais oui, Monsieur Lilley. He was speaking French, thinking that I didn't understand it. But you must realise that the European banking system has nearly been brought to its knees, and the world banking system has nearly been destroyed because of our failure to regulate Anglo-Saxon banks. And that tells you an awful lot about the attitudes endemic in Europe and in the Commission, that our financial problems are seen to be the result of Anglo-Saxon finance capitalism. They want to get hold of it, get a control of it, because they think it's dangerous and they don't like it, and they resent the fact that to the extent it's successful, it brings profit and wealth elsewhere. So we should be very wary. I can't understand why people in the city are not more wary about the thought of having their fate in the hands of people who don't actually like them.